This is called the Epiphania. It is one of only 2 surviving cartoons made by Michelangelo. In 2006, it was removed for scientific research, which revealed that the old glue and lining, which was almost as old as the drawing, was breaking down into acidic compounds which were slowly degrading this precious object. It wasn't until new facilities were built at the museum in 2014 that the museum could finally get around to solving these problems. This was no easy task. This is a piece so delicate that it takes 8 people and half a day's planning just to turn it over. This is the story of how to save a Michelangelo.
Hello, I'm Emma Turner, Senior Conservator for Western Art on Paper at the British Museum. One of the most exciting projects to have ever come to our studio is a cartoon by Michelangelo, known as the Epiphania. A cartoon is a 1-to-1 scale preparatory drawing for an artwork in another media. This cartoon was drawn by Michelangelo and was used by his friend and biographer Ascanio Condivi for the production of a panel painting. Epiphania is incredibly rare and important, being one of only 2 surviving cartoons by Michelangelo. The cartoon is made of 26 overlapping paper sheets, with the image being drawn in black chalk and charcoal. It became part of the British Museum's collection in 1895, and unlike many old master drawings, it had not been conserved since that time, remaining mounted on the pine wood panel it was presented to the museum on. Having been analysed in 2006, we knew that the 19th century pine panel was causing damage to the cartoon paper, contributing to it being brittle, weak and extensively discoloured. Because of this, we identified that Epiphania required a conservation treatment. Epiphania is so large that we had to wait until the new studios in the World Conservation and Exhibition Centre opened in 2014 to have enough space to treat it. In 2019, we collaborated with Factamarte to scan and make a digital record of Epiphania's 3-dimensional topography. This was part of a comprehensive documentation of the cartoon, which also included photography in various lighting conditions and the creation of a digital condition map. Combining these methods of documentation enabled us to better understand the condition of the cartoon, for example, recording historic repairs, tears and losses, and also to reveal features of the cartoon paper, such as the paper's watermarks. As with many things, planning for the Epiphania conservation project was disrupted by the COVID pandemic, so it wasn't until late 2022 that we were able to commit to it full time. By then, preparations were well underway for the British Museum's temporary exhibition, Michelangelo, The Last Decades, in which Epiphania and Condivi's corresponding panel painting were due to be displayed side by side. This was especially exciting, as it is believed that this would be the first time the pair had been united since the 16th century. Given the pinewood panel was found to be causing damage, we knew that our treatment would have to provide at least a new mounting solution and a frame, but that further treatment to preserve the Epiphania may be necessary. The first step was to lift the cartoon from its panel. To separate and lift the Epiphania away, layers of paper and canvas, which had been attached onto the front of the cartoon, had to be cut and carefully removed, layer by layer, with scalpels. To make a decision about the level of conservation treatment required, we needed to turn the cartoon over to assess the back, which is known as the verso. Prior to turning the cartoon over, we repeatedly checked that the black chalk and charcoal media was stable on the paper surface, as we couldn't risk altering the image through any action. The media was stable, but the paper surface was seen to be fragile. We used a very dilute spray of gelatine, which we had tested on model papers and found gave a good result. We used an airbrush and worked sequentially across the surface, taking great care to ensure an even coverage. Another advantage of using gelatine is that it is a traditional sizing ingredient which would have been used in the original formation of the cartoon paper. As such, we believed that we could achieve a secondary effect of reintroducing some strength to the cartoon paper through the action of gelatine being absorbed into the paper's structure. Having completed the consolidation, Epiphania was turned over to the verso. Given the size and fragility of the cartoon, this was no small undertaking. The safest way to turn the cartoon over was to sandwich it within soft and inert layers between 2 rigid boards. For each turning, hours of material preparation and rehearsal were required, along with 8 people from the conservation team. Once the cartoon was turned to the verso, we could see that the entire back of the cartoon was covered with a 19th century brown backing paper, and that this backing wasn't offering sufficient support. The brown paper was weak, fractured easily, leached brown discoloration, and there were air pockets where the brown paper was no longer adhered to the back of the cartoon. Because of this, we decided that we needed to remove the brown paper. Our next job was to remove the brown backing paper. Moisture was needed to soften both the backing paper and the adhesive for removal. However, it was clear that any uncontrolled introduction of water could cause significant physical and aesthetic changes to the Epiphania. To control the amount of water being introduced, we decided to use gels in our treatment. One type of gel used was a chemical hydrogel. These hold a large volume of water within their structure, which slowly transmits through tiny pores. This is the same technology which is found in a contact lens. We cut the hydrogel into small squares and placed them onto the brown backing paper, allowing time for it to humidify the paper and slightly swell the adhesive. Once the backing paper and adhesive were appropriately humidified, we then used tweezers, spatulas and blunted scalpel blades to remove the paper. It was clear from the outset that the verso of the cartoon was directly beneath the brown paper, so it was necessary to progress extremely carefully. It was painstaking work and required absolute concentration. As the brown paper was removed, we uncovered numerous historic tears that needed addressing in order to safely continue the treatment. Tears were temporarily supported using small splints of white Japanese paper. This secured the tears in position, but allowed us to return and repair the tears with perfect alignment at a later date. Using a team of up to 6 people a day, it took us 7 months to remove the backing paper. A lot of research had been undertaken in support of our conservation treatment. When the backing paper was finally removed, we were the first people to see the verso of the cartoon in 170 years. Even though we had to disappoint our curators with the news that there were no further Michelangelo drawings underneath the brown backing paper, seeing the verso of the cartoon was very exciting, as it provided further clues about the history of Epiphania. We observed the impression of 2 separate canvas linings, which had been removed prior to 1850. These linings would have been applied to give strength to Epiphania as it travelled through Europe, as well as to facilitate various historic mounting and framing campaigns. However, combined with the brown backing paper, it also meant that there were at least 3 layers of glue on the verso of the cartoon. Analysis of the adhesive layers confirmed the presence of starch and protein, which tallies with the traditional use of flour paste and boiled animal bone adhesives. In time, these glue layers become brown and brittle, so it's not surprising that Epiphania showed strong discoloration, was torn, and the black chalk and charcoal image appeared slightly indistinct. It was also apparent that the cartoon paper had become inherently degraded. Because of this, we decided that it was safest to thin the adhesive layers down, rather than remove them completely. At the same time, we thinned historic repair patches which were applied extensively across the verso, as this would help flatten the cartoon paper. As we worked, we repaired the cartoon's widespread tears and losses. Repairs were made using thin Japanese Mino paper, which is made from kozo fibres. Kozo fibres are long and provide a lot of strength, even when the paper is very lightweight, so it's an ideal choice. Some of the Mino paper was dyed brown so that it wouldn't be visible behind hairline tears. We used the Mino paper in conjunction with gluten-free wheat starch paste, which is a reversible conservation-grade adhesive. We infilled areas of loss with paper of a similar thickness to the cartoon, which was pre-dyed to a colour slightly lighter than the cartoon paper. Dyeing to a lighter colour was necessary because across the cartoon, the colour of the paper varied significantly, and it is extremely difficult to colour correct a paper which is too dark. When making repairs and infills to works of art on paper, it is necessary to use weights to press both the paper and the repair to prevent local undulation. Given the number of repairs and infills that Epiphania required, we quickly realised that we would need to make lots of extra weights to use in the treatment, so we were fast depriving the rest of the studio. To solve this problem, some of the Epiphania team developed newfound sewing skills to make cotton and silk coverings, which contained sealed bags of lead shot. Having completed the repair stage of the treatment, we were in position to face our biggest challenge, which was to reline the verso of the cartoon with conservation-grade paper. Relining was essential, as to mount and frame Epiphania for display, it had to be strong enough to hold its own weight. To help us in this stage of the treatment, we called upon the expertise of our specialist conservators for Eastern art and paper and silk, who are based within the museum's Hirayama studio. The Hirayama team routinely reline large format artworks, so their experience was especially useful. Between our 2 teams, we agreed that 3 layers of Japanese Mino paper would be fully adhered across the cartoon. The first layer was applied using relatively small rectangles of Mino paper, which meant we could more easily accommodate inherent features of Epiphania, such as the overlapping joins of the cartoon papers. It was essential to account for features such as these, as each has an impact on the cartoon's response to our treatment, which contributes to the overall success of the conservation. Using the example of the overlapping joins, these areas are twice as thick and consequently respond more slowly to moisture from the lining adhesive. If we didn't acknowledge this, by lining the overlaps separately and with a lighter paper, significant distortions would occur. Before the first lining layer was completed, we added a margin of paper around all 4 edges of the cartoon. This had 2 functions. It stabilised the edges, which were the areas with most loss, and it provided a border which enabled us to show the cartoon edges within a new frame. To make the margin, the edges of the cartoon were traced onto a polyester sheet. These tracings were then transferred to a dyed Japanese paper, allowing for an overlap onto the cartoon. We thinned the designated overlap of the Japanese paper down with a knife, which we refer to as paring down. Doing this meant that we didn't create additional thickness at the edges. Once prepared, the margins and the edges of the cartoon were checked for precise alignment and the margin was adhered in position. We then extended the first lining layer across the margin. The second lining layer made use of a slightly heavier weight Mino paper, so that the strength of the cartoon gradually increased with each lining. The size of the lining paper was also enlarged, and we rotated the grain direction of the paper so that we did not give an intrinsic curl to the cartoon. Throughout the first 2 linings, we kept the cartoon underweight as much as possible to prevent the degraded paper of Epiphania from contracting. The final layer of the lining was made of 8 rows of our heaviest weight Mino paper, with each row prepared in advance to span the full width of the cartoon. Years of experience enabled our 2 conservators for Japanese paintings to precisely paste, lift and adhere these long strips in position. Given the size of Epiphania, the wider conservation team were required to support the operation, for example, in ensuring that humidity was evenly distributed through the cartoon. Good adhesion of the lining was ensured by repeatedly brushing the Mino paper and using raking light so that we could check that no air pockets formed. After the final lining had been applied, we needed to turn the cartoon face up and place it on a wooden drying board to ensure that it dried as evenly as possible. We knew that this would be the most complicated turning operation, as Epiphania was even more vulnerable when wet. It wouldn't be possible to turn the cartoon in the way that we had previously, as it posed a risk of crushing temporary undulations which are associated with humid paper into creases. We devised a method which inserted a rigid board under the cartoon and used the newly applied Japanese paper margin to attach Epiphania to the board with bulldog clips. We then covered the cartoon surface with thick, non-woven fabric, which was also secured with bulldog clips. Having tested the system in advance, we knew that this method would be safe, but it was still a test of our nerves and our teamwork.
What?
7 members of the team turned it over so that Epiphania would be face up.
Blasters out.
4 people then held the rigid board above the drying board, whilst the rest of the team released the non-woven fabric and gently lowered Epiphania down. Epiphania was attached to a drying board so that it could dry evenly under tension, as well as achieve a greater overall flatness. We kept it on the drying board for as long as possible, which meant that it remained attached whilst we carried out many of the final treatments to the recto. These final treatments included adhering any areas of paper that were lifting, and finalising the colour matching of infills which we had started using the dyed Japanese paper. Colour matching from the front was achieved using watercolours and was done in such a way as to draw attention away from losses rather than recreate missing details of the image. Where there were small surface losses of the recto, we made infills that were adhered from the front and also toned with watercolour. Once the cartoon was fully dry and we had completed as much of the treatment as we could whilst it remained horizontal, we were ready to release Epiphania from the drying board. We had needed to replace the pine panel with something which offered appropriate structural support and which was inert and remained rigidly flat. Our expert conservation mounters undertook extensive research and testing, identifying the mounting materials that would be most suitable to support a large paper artwork. In producing the new panel, we decided to collaborate with the technical staff at London's National Gallery, as their team have the facilities and experience in reframing monumental scale artworks. We presented them with our chosen mounting material, a smooth-sided aluminium which has an internal aluminium honeycomb structure. The National Gallery team then structurally joined 2 sheets of this aluminium honeycomb together to make a single panel of the right size. Our conservation mounters then covered the aluminium panel in 100% cotton rag museum board, which would act as a buffer against any changes in relative humidity and pollutants. To release Epiphania from the drying board, thin and flexible bamboo spatulas were inserted underneath access tabs which we had positioned around the margin. Measurements were taken from the new aluminium panel and were used to square off and cut the cartoon surrounding Japanese paper margin to the correct size. A 3D rayon mesh, laminated between layers of Japanese paper, was prepared to use as the mounting material which would attach Epiphania to its new panel. This combination gave us the strength and flexibility we needed, whilst also enabling us to use a starch paste adhesive. Strips of the laminated 3D rayon paper were cut to size. These strips were first adhered into position on the margin and left to dry under weight. At this point, the cartoon was finally ready for mounting. Registration points were marked along the height and width of both Epiphania and the panel, ensuring that the cartoon would be accurately centred on the panel and within its frame. The cartoon was carefully moved across to the panel, where it was lightly humidified and weighted down in the correct position. We then wrapped the laminated 3D rayon strips around the panel, pasting the strips to the sides and verso of the panel. All of us had to work precisely and quickly to ensure that a secure bond formed between the mounting attachments and the panel, and that the mounting held the cartoon under light tension so that Epiphania remained flat. The following day, a secondary layer of Japanese paper was applied at the back of the panel, further securing the attachment. Once mounted, it was possible to move Epiphania into an upright position for the first time since 2018. This was an incredibly exciting moment for us. Being able to access the cartoon in an upright position allowed us to view the cartoon essentially as visitors to the museum would. The change in orientation allowed us to check and adjust the toning of our infills, which was really important, as the lighting type and angle impacts the way colours are perceived. We were so pleased to see that our treatments had subtly but positively affected the overall presentation of Epiphania. At around 6 foot, I was the tallest conservator working on Epiphania, and whilst it was on the table, even I found reaching the centre a bit of a stretch. Framing Epiphania was a really momentous day of the project, as it acknowledged that we had reached the point where we were satisfied we had completed the conservation treatment. It was also hugely exciting for us to see Epiphania fitted within a new frame, which had been specially designed to display the newly conserved cartoon. In addition to defining the space around the cartoon, the new frame was constructed to provide stable environmental control, which means that it functions as a core part of our long-term preservation strategy for Epiphania. The new Epiphania frame is effectively formed of 2 parts, a slim, portable glazed aluminium display case and a separate wooden veneer frame, which attaches to the front of the display case to provide a traditional framed presentation. Epiphania will first be displayed set within a temporary wall in the museum's Michelangelo The Last Decades exhibition. It will then return to permanent display. On permanent display, the presentation of the cartoon will be completed with the addition of a newly carved veneer frame. This wooden frame has also been made in collaboration with experts at the National Gallery. The frame design incorporates architectural elements and 16th century details, both of which are befitting of Michelangelo. So today we are installing the Epiphania cartoon into its permanent display location, which is in Gallery 90A. Getting it into the gallery was a real challenge. It's incredibly heavy, it's about 250 kilograms.
Since the exhibition, the piece has been in our storerooms, so we brought it through the galleries. We had some contractors come in to build the scaffolding, where we used a pedestrian stacker to then lift the object on a frame so we can move it across the stairs.
A huge amount of sort of thought and planning has gone into it. You know, everybody is professional, they know their jobs inside out, but it's still very nerve-wracking to see a huge cartoon, which is so valuable, sort of being hoisted into the air and put onto a platform.
Today we've now had to manipulate the drawing, get it into the right orientation, and we're currently about to install the drawing onto its hanging wall.
So we had a steel framework made that we've attached to the wall with a split batten, so when we lower the piece onto it, it engages and holds it tight to the wall.
I've not seen the frame yet in person, so it would be amazing to see sort of it fitted onto the front and really kind of complement the 16th century nature of the drawing.
It gives you an enormous sense of achievement when you see the thing actually on the wall and you see that final moment where it's the display.
Yeah, it's a relief to have it up on the wall, and I'm glad to have it out of storage so everyone can enjoy it again.
Today is a very kind of poignant day for me. It has been an incredible journey, especially with Michelangelo. There is nothing surpassing, really.
Working on the Epiphania has been the greatest technical challenge our team has ever faced. However, we have been daily rewarded with close proximity to a Renaissance masterpiece, increased experience in treating cartoons, a deeper knowledge of Michelangelo's materials and working methods, a greater understanding of Epiphania's history, and a closer professional network. What's been particularly pleasing is that our efforts have improved the visibility of the drawing and evened out the tone of the paper, whilst most importantly, we have removed so much of the material that was causing degradation. For any conservator of art on paper, working on the largest drawing by Michelangelo has to be the highlight of their career. For myself, and I'm sure I speak for all of the team, it's been an unbelievable privilege.